The morning of December 13th, 1944 was cold and gray over Lorraine. Inside Fort Jeanne d'Arc, the walls were still standing. Barely. The concrete had absorbed weeks of American artillery. Shells had warped the steel. The corridors smelled of smoke, damp stone, and empty ammunition crates. The garrison's food was gone. The ammunition was nearly gone. And the men inside, 511 of them, had been listening to the same sound for weeks. The methodical industrial percussion of guns that never seemed to stop. At 11 in the morning, Major Hans Voss, the fort's commanding officer, made a decision. He contacted the headquarters of the 101st Infantry, 26th Division, and asked for a truce. By 11:15, the negotiations were done. Slowly, the columns of German soldiers emerged from the battered doors of the garrison and surrendered to American troops. The warped steel and broken cement piled at the fort's sides told the rest of the story. Fort Jeanne d'Arc was the last of the Metz fortifications to fall. Pause on that. The last one. Because here is the detail that turns the whole picture from strange into something else entirely. The man responsible for this siege was George S. Patton. The general history remembers for speed, for the breakthrough at Avranches, for armor racing across France so fast that German staffs were still marking yesterday's positions on their maps. Patton did not fight sieges. Patton ended them by going around them. And yet, here he was. Weeks of grinding, cold, methodical work against a ring of 19th century fortresses outside a city in northeastern France. No sweeping flanks, no dramatic breakthrough, just artillery, mud, concrete, and time. The German officers inside that fortress system had a theory about why this was happening. And for a while, their theory looked correct. This is the story of what they got wrong. The German belief was not irrational. It was built on something real. Metz was not just a city. It was a system. A ring of more than a dozen fortifications, some of them built before the First World War, layered in depth, designed to make any attacker pay for every meter. The Germans who occupied and reinforced those positions in the autumn of 1944 understood something that Patton's reputation obscured. A general built for open ground is a different animal when the ground closes around him. Their calculation was simple. Hold the ring. Force the Americans into costly direct assaults. Bleed the Third Army's momentum until the rhythm that made it dangerous, the tempo, the speed, the relentless pressure, finally broke under the weight of the concrete. It almost worked. But the reason it didn't work is the part of this story that the clean version usually leaves out. To understand what the Germans were counting on, you have to go back to a road in northeastern France in late August of 1944. Third Army had just done something that Allied planners had projected would take the better part of a year. In a single month, Patton's columns had torn through France. 700 miles of advance, German formations disintegrating in front of them, supply lines stretching further with every dawn. The plan had been a careful, systematic campaign across France. What happened instead looked less like a campaign, and more like a controlled collapse of everything in Third Army's path. By the 29th of August, the advance effectively stopped. Not because of German resistance, because of gasoline. Third Army's fuel shortage had become acute. The lines of supply were being pulled across hundreds of miles of liberated France, and the trucks could not keep pace with the armor. Patton's spearheads were sitting on roads within 70 miles of the German border, engines idling, waiting for fuel that was not coming fast enough. The advance that had seemed unstoppable had simply run dry. Think about what that pause meant for the other side. The German High Command had been reacting to a Third Army that moved faster than their decision cycle. Every time a new defensive line was identified, Patton's columns had already passed it. Every time a counterattack was organized, the target had shifted. The Germans were not losing ground. They were losing the ability to read the battlefield at all. The fuel stop gave them something they had not had since August began: time. In early September, German Army Group G began planning counterattacks and organizing the defenses that would buy additional weeks to man the Siegfried Line. The terrain of Lorraine, more wooded and less favorable to armor than the open plains further west, worked in their favor. The autumn weather was closing in. Tactical air support, one of Third Army's decisive edges, became less reliable as the skies turned gray and wet. When Third Army's offensive operations resumed on the 5th of September, the research makes this plain. Third Army had substantially less physical and informational advantage over the enemy than it had carried through the summer. The Germans had read the pause correctly. They used every hour of it. Metz became the centerpiece of that reading. The fortress ring around the city was not improvised. It was a layered defensive architecture that predated the First World War, updated and reinforced, designed to absorb punishment and return it at cost. German commanders understood that Patton could not simply bypass Metz and leave a fortified position of that scale across his supply lines and eastern flank. He would have to deal with it. And dealing with it, in their calculation, meant attacking into prepared concrete defenses, exactly the kind of fighting that stripped speed of its value. The belief inside the German command was coherent. Metz would not be a battlefield. It would be a door that Patton, for all his fury, could not force open quickly. For a while the door held. What the Germans had not fully accounted for was what Patton was actually doing on the other side of it. There is an image worth holding on to here. Not Patton in his command vehicle, maps spread across his knees, plotting the next armored thrust. Not the famous general of the open road. Instead, an American artillery crew in the mud outside Metz, in the cold, in the rain, loading and firing, loading and firing. Not racing anywhere, not outflanking anyone, just the same mechanical rhythm, hour after hour, directed at the same ring of stone and concrete that had been there since before their fathers were born. This is the part that doesn't fit the legend, and it is the part that mattered most. Patton had visualized a push toward Metz as far back as March of 1944, months before the Normandy landings, when most of his staff had not even arrived in England yet. His vision for the battle for France was not a systematic reduction of German positions. His own thinking rejected that model. He believed in armor, in mobility, in the cavalry principle that strength lives in movement. When the fuel ran out and Lorraine's terrain closed around his columns, the instinct was to find another way through, another gap, another road that the German map had not yet marked. But the gap was not there, not yet. I want to pause here and say something about what Patton did next, because it is the part that gets flattened in the popular version of the story. The popular version makes Metz into a frustration, an obstacle that slowed the great man down. What the record actually shows is something more precise. Patton adapted, not reluctantly, not as a temporary concession to bad luck. He turned the siege into a deliberate instrument. The artillery that hammered Fort Jeanne d'Arc and the other positions in the Metz ring was not a substitute for maneuver. It was maneuver by another name. The methodical application of industrial pressure at a point the enemy could not abandon, could not reinforce fast enough, and could not outlast. The guns did not stop. The supply of shells did not stop. The containing units did not stop. What the Germans inside the fortress system were experiencing was not a stalled offensive. It was a different kind of offensive entirely. One that used patience the way Patton usually used speed. Let me put that side by side. The German doctrine of fortress defense assumed that the attacker's most dangerous weapon was tempo, the pressure that comes from an enemy moving faster than you can respond. Slow the tempo, and you neutralize the threat. Metz was designed to slow the tempo. What it could not account for was an attacker who simply replaced tempo with volume, not speed, but mass. Not maneuver, but sustained, methodical, overwhelming fire. The kind of fire that an American army in the autumn of 1944 could sustain almost indefinitely because the industrial chain behind it did not break the way a human garrison eventually does. The 3 Corps artillery crossed the Moselle River in November and set up its fire direction center in a catacomb-like cellar next to a village church, the population long evacuated. From there, liaison aircraft flew reconnaissance along the front lines, spotting for the guns. Interdiction fires cut the roads leading east from Metz. Counter-battery missions neutralized German artillery. The squeeze tightened every day. Personnel at the Fire Direction Center could look out and see smoke-shrouded Metz on clear days, the stronghold slowly running out of room and time. The garrison inside Fort Jeanne d'Arc was not being defeated by a brilliant flanking maneuver. It was being defeated by arithmetic. The German commanders, who had designed the Metz defense around the premise of bleeding Patton's tempo, were now facing a problem their doctrine had not fully modeled. They had assumed the attacker would eventually have to choose, pay the price of direct assault against fortified concrete, or divert resources and attention elsewhere. Either choice, in their calculation, cost the Americans something significant. A direct assault meant casualties and time. A diversion meant leaving Metz unresolved. A fortified position across Third Army's flank and supply lines that would have to be dealt with later, at greater cost. What they had not fully weighted was the third option. The Americans did not assault frontally into the teeth of the defenses. They did not divert and leave Metz behind. They encircled, they contained, they cut the roads. They applied artillery with the consistency of a factory shift, not a dramatic bombardment designed to break morale in a single night, but a sustained rotating pressure that the garrison could not escape, could not be reinforced against, and could not outlast. Read that twice. A factory shift, because that framing matters. The German military tradition, at its best, was built on the idea of the skilled practitioner, the trained officer exercising judgment, the NCO making decisions without orders, the unit that could improvise when the plan broke down. It was a system that rewarded individual competence and tactical flexibility. It had produced extraordinary results across 2 wars and multiple theaters. What it struggled to defeat was an opponent who did not need to be flexible, because the opponent had enough of everything. Inside the fortress ring, the calculation that had seemed rational in September was beginning to look different by November. The roads east of Metz were under interdiction fire. Resupply was becoming unreliable. The artillery that began each morning and continued through the day was not the artillery of an army running low on shells. It was the artillery of an army that had more shells than the garrison had days. The 3 Corps records described the fire support during the squeeze on Metz in precise terms: counter battery to neutralize German guns, harassment and interdiction to cut movement, direct support fires for the infantry units pressing the containing line. On one operation in November, the Corps artillery participated in preparation supporting the adjacent Sottile Corps attack, then shifted to support the 5th Infantry Division, then shifted again to support the 6th Armored Division's advance. The same guns, different targets, continuous output. Think about what that number means for the garrison inside the ring. Every day that passed without a relief column arriving was a day in which the arithmetic moved further against them. The food stocks were not being replenished. The ammunition was being spent. The concrete walls were absorbing damage that could not be repaired under fire, and the American guns outside were not going anywhere. German officers inside the fortress system had constructed their defense around a model of the enemy, an American army that needed speed to function, that would lose cohesion and will when forced into the slow, grinding work of a siege. The model was built on genuine observation. Patton's army had functioned that way through the summer. The Germans were not wrong about what they had seen. They were wrong about what they were seeing now. By the time the full weight of this became clear inside the Metz fortifications, the situation had shifted from a calculated defensive hold to something closer to a sealed room. The garrison could resist. It could inflict casualties. It could force the Americans to pay for every approach. What it could not do was change the underlying arithmetic. Every morning the guns resumed. Every day the food got a little shorter. Every week the shells in the magazines numbered a little less. If you like war stories told from the moment the other side realized something had gone wrong, this is exactly that kind of story. And that moment was arriving, slowly, for the men inside those concrete walls. Leave a comment below with what you think the German commanders inside Metz understood first: that the food would run out, or that the relief column was never coming. The last and most stubborn position in the ring was Fort Jeanne d'Arc. By early December, the 3rd Corps had become responsible for the final reduction of the remaining Metz fortifications. The containing units, including the 101st Infantry of the 26th Division, maintained the pressure. The artillery continued. The fort had become, in the words recorded in the 3 Corps history, a torch. Food exhausted, ammunition spent, the desire to fight dissolved in empty stomachs and bare shell cases. The Germans inside had held longer than most, but they had not held long enough. Here is the part the clean version of this story usually skips. The siege of Metz wasn't a comfortable operation for the Americans pressing it. The autumn of 1944 in Lorraine was wet, cold, and grinding in a way that the summer's pursuit across France had not prepared anyone for. The terrain that favored the defenders, the wooded hills, the river crossings, the dense network of fortified positions, extracted a price from the attacking and containing units that does not appear in the summary statistics of the campaign. The infantry companies holding the containing line around the Metz fortifications were not racing anywhere. They were standing in mud, in rain, in dropping temperatures, maintaining pressure against positions that could return fire at any moment. The artillery crews that sustained the interdiction and counter-battery missions were working in the open, in the cold, with the knowledge that German guns were still capable of answering. The logistical chain that kept the shells moving forward, the trucks, the depots, the roads through Lorraine, was being stretched across a lengthening line of supply that had already once run dry. The machine was working, but the machine had a human interior, and that interior was being worn down by the same weeks that were wearing down the garrison inside the forts. There was a real risk embedded in this period that the outcome tends to obscure. The German offensive in the Ardennes, what would become the Battle of the Bulge, launched on the 16th of December, just 3 days after Fort Jeanne d'Arc surrendered. The 3 Corps, its battle baptism barely complete, was ordered to Longwy on the 18th of December to meet the German counteroffensive. The forward echelon closed its command post at Metz and moved to Luxembourg City the following day. Pause on that sequence. The unit that had spent weeks grinding down the last fortress at Metz was in motion toward one of the most critical engagements of the entire Western Front, within 72 hours of the garrison's surrender. There was no recovery period. There was no pause to consolidate what had been won. The corps that had been baptized in the slow, methodical work of a siege was immediately required to become something else entirely. A rapid reaction force moving to plug a crisis that threatened to split the Allied line. This is where the institutional blindness of the German calculation becomes most visible in hindsight. The assumption behind the Metz defense, that bleeding Patton's tempo would break the Third Army's capacity to act, had not accounted for what happened when the slow work was done. The army that emerged from the Metz siege was not an exhausted force looking for rest. It was a force that had just proven it could sustain a completely different kind of war, and was now being turned loose on open ground again. The machine had not broken. It had changed gears. On the cold gray morning of December 13, 1944, Major Hans Voss walked out of Fort Jeanne d'Arc and quietly answered the questions of Brigadier General Harlan N. Hartness and Colonel Walter T. Scott of the 26th Division. 511 German officers and enlisted men stood listlessly beside him. At the fort's sides were piled the warped steel and broken cement that signified defeat. The fort that was supposed to outlast Patton had run out of food first. The fort that was supposed to break the Third Army's rhythm had instead given the Three Corps its battle baptism. And within 72 hours, that same corps was moving northeast toward the Ardennes, where it would become part of the relief of Bastogne and earn the name it carried for the rest of the war, the Phantom Corps. What the German defense at Metz had tried to weaponize was time. The assumption was that time favored the defender, that a general built for speed would spend himself against the concrete, that the weeks of grinding attrition would hollow out the Third Army's capacity before the fortress ring gave way. The record shows what actually happened. The garrison ran out of food and ammunition. The American guns did not run out of shells. The industrial chain behind the siege, the depots, the trucks, the rotating artillery missions, the containing infantry, outlasted the human endurance inside the fortifications, not because the Americans did not suffer. They did, but because the system behind them was built to sustain exactly this kind of war, even when the general commanding it had not planned to fight it this way. This is where the story stops being about Patton the individual and becomes about something larger. The German tradition had produced brilliant soldiers, skilled officers, and a defensive doctrine that was genuinely formidable. The Metz fortress system had done what it was designed to do. It had slowed the Third Army, extracted a cost, and held for weeks against an enemy with every material advantage. But the fortress had been designed to defeat a tempo. And when the tempo was replaced by volume, by the patient, industrial, relentless accumulation of pressure that an American army in late 1944 could sustain almost without limit, the doctrine had no answer. The concrete door had held for weeks. Then it ran out of time, and on the morning of December 13th, it opened. If you want to debate whether Metz was a strategic success for Patton or a costly detour that the fuel crisis forced on him, that argument is very much alive among historians, and I would genuinely like to read your verdict in the comments below.